that I read him, and I've had to teach Aristotle and read him, I just go, man, how did he get this right? Is this a Holy Spirit thing? Is this a natural, we call it natural revelation thing? Is this secret assistance from God that not even Aristotle knows about? Or did Aristotle have some kind of proto-Christian faith even? We do have people like even Rahab, like she's not a Christian, she's not a Jew. How did she know? How did she know to help these people? Was she just a traitor, right? Or did she have some sense of they're on the good side and I'm not, and I need to join the good side, right? I hate when people say, God's on my side. No. You're on God's side, hopefully. Probably not, because you're sinning. So that's what I want to talk about Aristotle. I decided that the best way to do this would be to blitz through 6 big points from the Nicomachean Ethics. Have we read any Aristotle yet? I know he's on the syllabus. Have we read any of the... Hello! So, not to hold you in suspense, there's the key points and some key quotes from the Nicomachean Ethics.
It's actually better than in the service.
Oh, wow.
There's like the greatest trainer. We like to talk about it.
I didn't know that was allowed. Oh my god. Oh my goodness.
What did I say to you? Sacrilegious. It is.
Sacrilege.
It's unbiblical.
Or is it sac-delicious? It's Homer Simpson. He's like, sacrilegious. Forbidden donuts.
Okay, is she here now?
Hello. I am calling you on your friendly neighborhood
the microphone
Zoom call.
Your friendly neighborhood Zoom call.
Hi.
Would you like to write back in?
If you're like me, you worry about male pattern baldness.
No, that would be me. There's no pattern whatsoever.
I like the company so much, I bought it. Okay.
He's not replying. Okay.
Can you hear me? I'm talking to you.
She says no.
She's
Okay. This man.
Not to break your dating to watch.
She could call in on my phone.
Let's see if.
Hello.
Is that picking up on Zoom?
Check.
If that works,
Yes.
I can try.
Baby Yoda.
Yes.
There we go.
Baby Yoda.
You know, if I had just, after all those years of education, just realized, pick up the microphone.
Oh.
Yeah. So there you go.
So, a little bit about me. Try to keep it brief. I went to Biola University, which is like the Masters of a little bit south, yeah. Trying to be. And I'm married. My wife was supposed to be here tonight. Baby got sick. Probably not sick, but like felt sick, and so we have to be careful. So been married 10 years as of May. We were supposed to go to our 10-year anniversary, but it was canceled by Corona. We got 4 kids, including a 7-week-old. So definitely have a fresh little butterball baby. He's very fat. He's so fat. He was born 10 pounds. He's now like 14 pounds, which is great because he's extra padded, like you got 3 siblings. If they drop him, he just bounces, Sorry, I'm not a sociopath. So that's me, and I've been teaching at Trinity for 3-4 years now. Been in education for 13 years, and just love learning, love being a student, and that's how I keep my books in my life as I teach books now. So definitely happy to hear your pushback. I'm going to say some things that I hope raise a few red flags in your mind, and then you want to object and say, that can't be right. But I'm just going to say them and let you react, okay? So, what?
I said we're not going to acknowledge any of it.
We're just going to be like, I agree. You are completely right.
And that'll happen with this group.
If both of us agree, then one of us is unnecessary. That's okay. So my experience reading Aristotle, he was assigned to me in college, and I opened it up. I went to the library. I promptly fell asleep, and then I tried again, and I opened it up and I read it, and I thought, I think I understand this page. It's been an hour, and I've only gotten through a page, but I think I get it. And so I was kind of hooked. That's my personal reason why Aristotle is fun. I just find him to be very insightful, a little bit hard, a little bit sleepy sometimes, but generally rewarding. He has this title in Dante Alighieri, the Divine Comedy, which you should also read. You should probably also read. And Dante doesn't even refer to him by his name. He says, "Oh, I saw Plato, I saw Socrates, and then I saw the master of those who know." That's Aristotle. Of all the people who know things, just like, not like any particular thing, like scientists, philosophers, their master is Aristotle. He's the leader of the choir. And he had that reputation for more than 1,000 years. His suite of key ideas permanently affected Western consciousness. Even the very divisions that we use today for sciences were basically invented by Aristotle. He was like, I'm going to write a book about this topic, and that became a science, right? I'm going to write a book about this topic, and that became a separate science. And we preserve those in universities and so on today. The word, psychology. No one's majoring in psychology. You're all majoring in classical arts. This is so good. But psychology, right, is study of the soul, and he just wrote a book on the soul, De Anima. And it's like, hey, we should think about the soul. That should be a discipline. Today we talk about science and faith, right? We talk about faith and learning, faith and science, Christianity and science, logic. Do these things compete, or do they contrast, or do they somehow complement? In the 1500s, it was faith and Aristotle. Does faith and Aristotle agree? In the thousands, it was, does faith and Aristotle agree? Because Aristotle was just shorthand for science. Just everything true about the world that people can know, it's in Aristotle. So that's a pretty big reputation. His reputation dropped somewhat in the scientific revolution, but his non-scientific writing is just as fresh as ever. That's what we're going to look at. And finally, as a Christian, if you just look at great Christians from the past who were intellectuals, poets, thinkers, monks, like Dante, Aquinas, Maximus the Confessor, struggling with Aristotle is good for you. It generates good ideas even when he's wrong. And I don't know, I'm going to give you some hard things maybe he's right about today. Okay. So what does he say in the Nicomachean Ethics? This is obviously a limited summary, but there's one particular thrust of his argument that points to human beings being godlike when they're wise. And I just think, man, that seems pretty right. And so here's how the argument goes, and I'm going to just read it, and then we're going to go over each one in a bit more detail, and I'll give you a quote. He assumes, and he argues, that everything has a purpose. Every natural thing has a purpose. Human beings are part of nature, and therefore we have a purpose. That's interesting. Humans by nature have the potential, define potential as a set of capacities that might be used or not used, actualized or not actualized. We have the potential for virtue and wisdom, and we'll define those terms. So our purpose, roughly, is to actualize that potential, to become indeed what we are by nature, only potentially. The way that an acorn's purpose is to become indeed what it is by nature. It's an acorn of an oak tree. It's not an acorn of a elm tree. It's not an acorn of an aardvark. It's not an acorn of a piece of granite. It's an acorn of a particular thing. It's just not there yet, and it's supposed to become that thing. So for us to actualize our potential requires the basic necessities, physical necessities of growing, food, water, etc., but also, more importantly, education or formation, habituation, which is a vocab word that you may not know. Habituation the process of forming a habit. And contemplation. And we'll tie that into the verse in Luke 2 where it talks about how Jesus grew in wisdom and stature. Happiness, then, is our purpose. It's that thing that we're going towards by nature, or should be going towards, and it's the full actualization of our potential in an active life spent practicing the virtues. So just as oak trees grow, human beings act. That's what we do. That's what makes us who we are. So to act well is to be good. And he distinguishes moral and intellectual virtues because they're different parts of the soul. And interestingly enough, even though for 90% of the Nicomachean Ethics, this book on ethics, for 90% of it is talking about moral virtue. Moral virtue. You can come away from that book understandably mistaken that it's a book all about moral virtue. Teeny tiny bit about intellectual virtue in the beginning, and then book 6, and then he returns to it at the end. So literally about 90% is not about intellectual virtue, and yet if you read him carefully, I think what he's saying is intellectual virtue is where the money is at. That's where we become truly what we can be and become indeed godlike. His definition of God, but again, I'm just going to show you the quotes and see what he says. And so that culminates in the final point. The ultimate human virtue, if you will, is performing a particular intellectual activity, the contemplation of God. Okay. So that's my word summarizing a particular line of argument of the Nicomachean Ethics. Here's Aristotle's words. Oh, no, here's what he does not say. He does not say human beings were afflicted by original sin. So he's not assuming you're fallen and you need some kind of outside help. He does reference help from the gods. We'll look at that. But he's not assuming that you are incapable of reaching your potential. So that's interesting. Okay, we might want to fight with him on that. We might want to pick a fight on that. He also doesn't say virtue is easy. So sometimes when I am trying to simplify things, I say things like, an acorn grows up to an oak tree. A human being grows from a baby into a virtuous, wise, godlike saint. It's easy. And people say, foul. It's hard to do anything right even sometimes, right? So doing everything right all the time, all day, every waking hour, there must be something wrong with this story if it's not that easy. And of course, he doesn't actually say it's that easy. He says it's hard, and he does set a pretty high bar. So we'll talk about what he says, talk about, again, what he doesn't say, and then we'll talk about what you say. Okay. So going back to point 1, here's a quote. Everything has a purpose. He says, this is the first line of the Nicomachean Ethics, very famous line. I think it's beautiful. He says, every art and every inquiry, and similarly, every action and pursuit is thought to aim at some good. Some good. That is to say, some goal. For this reason, the good, capital G, you could imagine, has rightly been declared to be that at which all things aim. And a little later, the good and the chief good is the end of the things we do, which we desire for its own sake, everything else being desired for the sake of this. So it's not just that everything has a purpose. This has a purpose over here, and this has a purpose over here, and this has a purpose over here, and that they're disconnected. Everything in the human motivational structure has a goal, and those goals lead to other goals, and they lead to a final goal, which is the good, capital G. And so it's more like a web of nodes and branches. So everything you do when you wake up in the morning and get dressed, you're doing it for the sake of the good, eventually. Like for the sake of something else, for something else, for something else. And when you get married, you're doing it for the sake of the good. And when you pray, you're doing it for the sake of the good. And when you even do things that are sort of maybe self-destructive or harmful, you are aiming at the good, maybe ineffectively, but you're aiming at something that will get you to the good. This is his, I don't know if he even argues for this, but this is his assumption, and the whole book builds on this premise, that we're always aiming, and that even other natural things which don't have a will are aiming for their ends. So I didn't size this appropriately, so I may have to use the handout. But so what does it mean for us to say that we have the potential for virtue and wisdom? He says there's what you are, there's what you do, and then there's what you do well. So your mind is a mind, and what does that mind do? It thinks. And what does it mean to think well? When you're thinking well, what's happening?
Think accurately.
Thinking accurately. So your thinking is tracking with the way things are, right? So thinking well is like hitting on the truth. Thinking accurately is just as good. Your emotions are another part of your soul, and sometimes your thoughts and your feelings go wildly different directions, right? So when you're feeling well, then you have virtue. You're feeling the right amount of sadness at the right time, in the right way, about the right things. You're not overly sad, and you're not underly sad. And so this would be usually, the mean meaning the middle, the in-between, the intermediate. You're not excessive, you're not too little. So this is intellectual virtue. And this is one of the moral virtues. And what about those other pesky things that we have that they're not exactly like desires, they're not exactly like emotions, but they're desires. Even sometimes you can want something and be mad at yourself for wanting it. So that's two different things, right? And you can be thinking to yourself, man, I'm glad I'm mad for wanting that because I don't think I should want that. But I'm also a little bit sad that I'm mad because I've been working on my anger and it's like, I'm still angry. So these can all like interact, right? So when your desires also hit the mean, you don't desire too much or too little. That's another moral virtue. So moral virtue has to do with doing well the things that you do because of what you are. Namely, you're a human being with emotions and desires. You have a soul. But you're also a rational being, and so you have to think well and not just be moderate. So here's the famous function argument broken down very, very simply. Just as a flute player or a sculptor or an artist, and in general for all things that have a function or activity, right? They have something that they do. There is a good, right? The good and the well is thought to reside in the function. How can you do flute playing well if you're not actually playing the flute, right? Because it is a flute. It's intended to be played. So it would seem to be for man, if he has a function, that his goodness resides in his functioning well. Have the carpenter then and the tanner certain functions or activities, and man as a whole has no function? This is basically what our secular culture thinks. Your purpose is to find out what your purpose is, man. Yeah, that's not a purpose, okay? That's an empty slot where a purpose should be, and if you say it's empty, everything you do after that you're admitting it's pointless. The joys in the journey. Yeah, the joys in the journey if the journey is going to the right spot, right? If the journey is going to a cliff, and that cliff is going to the void, and that void is going to the pit of hell, then the joy is not in the journey. So, and people say, oh, you find your own function. Well, no, because I am a human being. I don't get to decide to be an angel or an aardvark or a tree. I am human. Therefore, these activities are simply what I do. Therefore, I have to do them well to be a good human being. And he asks this in a rhetorical question because he can't imagine somebody coming back and saying, a tanner has a purpose, a flute player has a purpose, but man has no purpose. And that's exactly what many of our contemporaries say. Is he born without a function, or has the eye and the hand and the foot, and in general each of the parts evidently a function? May one not lay it down that a man similarly has a function apart from all these. There's the whole function, the whole thing that you do as a human. Gerard Manley Hopkins, you're a fan of Gerard Manley Hopkins' poetry. He has this poem where he turns all these nouns into verbs, right? He says, a just man, what does a just man do? He justices. Right? Like he's going around justicing things all the time. And rocks, self. They self. What are they doing? They're selfing all the time. They're, look at it, being a rock. Rocks, rock on. You know what I'm saying? Rocks are rocking. No. It doesn't say that. That's my... but like things are being themselves. It's an activity, right? So what is humaning? You are humaning when you think, I'm dyslexic, pardon me. When you think, feel, and desire, you're humaning. When you are in school, like people say, why should I learn math? Because when you're learning math, you're humaning. Not because you're going to use it later, but because you're using it right now to be a good person. So he says, he assumes that there must be a function particular to man. And here's what another assumption, big assumption. The function of man can't be something that's common to plants and animals. It has to be the thing that we do that nothing else in the cosmos does. And so he lists these activities. What do plants do? They grow and they are nourished, right? Automatically. So we also grow and are nourished, but that can't be our function. Nor would it be the life of perception. We have 5 senses. Lizards have 5 senses, but they don't think. Okay? People always say, well, what about orangutans and dolphins and ravens, things like that? Even they don't think on a level of abstraction that we do. A raven can solve a problem, but you can't ask the raven, what was it like for you to solve that problem, and have like a nice long conversation about that. And even Lucy the gorilla, I've watched the footage of her talking and signing and stuff like that. You can reduce her sign use to cause effect. Thing, sign. It's not a language system where you have references and things like that.
And they're not creative, they do not make art.
They don't make art. They can be forced. They can be forced to do a drawing over and over and over and over, right? Like elephants. But they have to be tortured from a very young age to do this one drawing over and over and over and over. Whereas little kids, you give them like a crayon, and they're already inventing things that no one's ever made before in the history of the world, right? It's like, this is a circle, and they're like, I can draw circles on the wall! And you're like, I regret the crayons! That's why we get washable markers. But yes, creativity is rational. So even if dolphins have names for each other, do they invent names? Do they have pet names? Do they have nicknames? Do they have ridiculous names for their cats? The answer is no. Okay. So it's not the life of senses, perceptions, even imagination to an extent. Dogs seem to have imagination when they can dream about chasing something, right? They can dream, and then they wake up running into a wall. So there remains an active life of the element in our soul, the element that has logos. And I took out the English translation there. They said rational principle, but I like the word logos, right? Logos. Because it's an important word for the Greeks, it's an important word in the New Testament. There's something in our soul that has logos, and our function has to be tied to logosing, okay? Which, again, has some very strong theological connotations, if you ask me. And this is from a different section, but if intellectual virtue, the chief intellectual virtue is wisdom, so we've got, do you guys know your cardinal virtues? What are practical wisdom is one of the 4 cardinal virtues. What are the other 3? C.S. Lewis writes about them. Cicero writes about them. You can be wrong.
Temperance.
That is correct.
Prudentia.
Temperance. And I spell this wrong all the time. Is it E-A or A? Is it E-A or E-E? Temperance.
Prudence.
Temperance slash moderation. Same idea. Self-control is another biblical synonym for moderation. Sophrosune. Self-control. That particularly has to do with desires, more so than emotions, right? Your emotions you might have to control, but emotions are more reactions. You can't control them. Your desires, you can say no, right? We teach our kids, you tell your belly no. My belly wants some more dessert. Well, you tell your belly no, okay? Because it's not you, it's just a desire that's like, nah, more, okay? And then a couple more.
Prudence.
That's wisdom.
Well,
Darn is not one of them that I know of. If you say darn too much, then gosh will punish you with heck. So, what's another one? What about C.S. Lewis says every virtue at its sticking point. When you continue pursuing that virtue even when it's hard, doing the good no matter what.
Fortitude.
That's it.
Fortitudo.
Yeah, it's coming back to me.
And fortitudo is also called courage. And that's more maybe of an emotional one, where you have to be like, let's do this. You're going to jump in a freezing cold lake, you got to get pumped, you got to get psyched. If you're going to face a temptation, you got to get psyched. You can't be like, I think I'll just resist that temptation. And you're going to fall right into it, right? You'll be like, no, never, not my watch. That's how you pump yourself up. Practice fortitude. And then we're missing one. I always tell people the one you forget is the one that you struggle with. That really gets in your head. I always forget moderation, so. The last one is.
I don't know anything, so I guess I struggle with all of this.
You're like, I have none of these. Start now. Start today. Justice is. This is a hard one. This is a hard one because we don't think of justice as a virtue. We think of justice as an action, maybe, or a system, right? But he says, no, justice is the disposition to give people what they are owed and to demand what is owed to you. You don't let people disrespect you, and you don't let people not pay you back, and you don't demand that people give you things that don't belong to you, right? That's justice in a nutshell. So it's a disposition, it's a personal trait that you can cultivate. And if you are, like, for example, a Supreme Court justice, you better have that trait of justice. So they are related, but it's not just for judges, it's for all human beings. Okay, so this is humaning. He says, it's clear from what's said that it's not possible to be good without practical wisdom. You probably can't have the other three virtues without this one. And it's not possible to be practically wise without the other three virtues. This is a hard one for me, but think of it this way. How well would you do in school if you were an alcoholic? Right? If all day all that was on your mind was getting your next drink, how well could you pay attention and retain? Your underlying moral corruption would ruin your intellectual growth. Does that make sense? So, and the same would be true for courage. What if you were great at studying until it got hard? So like the first 15 minutes? I got my Aristotle, I got my new notebook, I got my new pencil, I got my laptop, I'm charging. Let's see, what else can I distract myself with? Coffee, I need to get coffee. You come back, and I'm reading Aristotle, and boom, head desk, right? If you don't have courage, you're never going to develop wisdom. And similarly, perhaps, if you don't have justice, you're never going to develop wisdom. So they do support each other. This is where he starts to talk about the gods, right? He says, that all these attributes belong most of all to the wise man is manifest, that is obvious. He, the wise man, therefore is dearest to the gods. Remember, wisdom being the virtue that most connects with your mind, which most connects with your humanity. Because you need to keep your animal nature in check, basically just so it'll stay out of the way so you can learn. I mean, obviously there's some good to this as well, but mostly you want your animal nature to cooperate with your mind, shooting for the stars, getting as wise as you can be, because that's how you're going to be happiest. And presumably the wise man is the one that's going to be the happiest, so that in this way too, the wise man will more than any other be happy. So now he's tying in not only happiness, doing well, humaning well with happiness, but he's tying it in with blessedness, dearness to the gods. What does Psalm 1 say? Blessed is who?
Blessed the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. His delight is in the law of the Lord. And in his law does he meditate day and night. And he shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water that shall.
Which is
Beautiful.
Fruit yield in season. And he shall not wither.
Of the wicked. The wicked and also shall. They are like chaff. Therefore, something.
Therefore the ungodly shall not stand in the day of judgment, nor
Or in the
the
congregation.
congregation of the righteous.
And then the last one is the Lord knows the way of the righteous, right? But the way of the wicked shall perish. So notice the language there, and don't let me import Aristotle into the Bible, okay? I'm just saying some things to put up some red flags for you. Notice that psalm connects flourishing, producing fruit, humaning well, with both virtue, not walking in the counsel of the wicked, and blessedness, because God knows your way. If God knows your way, you're blessed, you're favored. And the way of the wicked, wiped off the face of the planet. God's like, wicked who? I forgot about that, right? Now, there's this line in Luke 2 that I used to think was just an interesting one-off, but Luke says, Luke's one of the only ones, he's the only one in the canon that mentions Jesus between infant and 30-year-old man starting his ministry. He has the story of Jesus in the temple with Mary and Joseph, right? And he loses them, and they say, "Where were you?" And he says, "You should have known where I would be."
It's the most panicked moment anywhere in the New Testament. Get yourself to the side.
Has anyone seen the Messiah? So, yeah, and Jesus is totally chill about it. Like, if I would have said that, I would have got slapped, you should have known where I would be. This is actually your problem, Mom. I think that's proof Jesus was a real teenager, right? That is like legit teenager stuff right there. I was just talking to my teachers. You should be happy for me. No, I don't think he had attitude. Okay, and we're not saying Jesus had sass. But it does say, Luke says at the end of that, he says, he grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and men. And that seems so perfect. Wisdom, the crown of virtues. Stature, he was eating and drinking and growing, right? Like that's, Aristotle was like, look, you're a little teeny tiny thing and then you grow to be a full grown thing. That's part of your maturation. And not just growing and becoming more wise, but becoming more favored by God. And it is a blessing. Aristotle calls it an external blessing to be favored by men, to have honor. It's an external blessing. Not strictly speaking necessary for happiness, but it's sure nice. Same with money, and he mentions good birth and these things. So I'm just trying to draw your attention to this idea that humaning well equals virtue, which leads to personal happiness and also blessing with the gods. There's a lot of overlap there. This is one of the famous sections, famous quotes in the first part of the book, where he says, the function of man is the good and noble performance of these human activities, and if any action is performed well, it's performed in accordance with the particular virtue. And so our human good turns out to be the activity of the soul exhibiting virtue. So you can't be happy just feeling a certain feeling. You can't be sitting in the movie theater with the John Williams score going, and like a Coke in your hand and like your mouth full of peanut butter popcorn or
Peanut butter
let me
popcorn.
rewind that. Peanut butter M&Ms and popcorn.
There we go.
You know, and you're like, this is nirvana. I have achieved happiness. It's like, no, that's an experience. Happiness is an activity. It's something you do. A bird can't like feel things and be a perfect bird. It has to fly. Okay, and so we already kind of covered this. There are moral and intellectual virtues, and the intellectual virtues seem to be where the action is at. He says the virtue of a thing is relative to its proper work. The work of the intellectual parts of the soul is truth. We already said that. Jonah got that one correct. So here's the, to me, the most shocking and inspiring and beautiful bits of the Nicomachean Ethics. Again, they're very short. They're tucked away in the back of the book, and yet they seem to be very, very important. He says that perfect activity is contemplative, or perfect happiness is a contemplative activity will appear from the following consideration as well. So I'm going to argue that happiness isn't feeling good, having money, and it's not even being virtuous, if by that you mean just moral virtue. It's a particular kind of intellectual activity. Happiness is this activity. How am I going to prove that? First, I'm going to prove that's what the gods do, and they're the most blessed. And so now it follows that the human being who's the most like God also does that same thing. Okay? Yeah.
Where would you fit joy into that?
Define joy, like permanent happiness.
Would he say that like happiness and joy are one and the same, or are they? If happiness is not feeling,
Basically, yeah.
he would say that.
Yeah, he says that the virtuous life, if you're truly virtuous, you actually enjoy doing virtuous things.
Right.
It's not like a self-discipline thing. So he says the virtuous life is actually the most pleasurable, more so than the person who's chasing pleasure, because they eventually get decreasing returns, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as a matter of fact, it's the most pleasurable. That's not the point. It's not like, I want to live the most pleasurable life. So in terms of pleasure, happiness has the most pleasure, virtue has the most pleasure. Joy being like a spiritual connection with like the ultimate goodness that is God, that makes everything that is kind of bad seem not so bad. He doesn't have a concept of that. Yeah. He does concede, and this is like those bizarre moments where he's like, but yeah, like if you didn't have any money, you probably couldn't be happy. So it's like he's imagining, you know, you're a perfectly virtuous person, but let's say you're poor, destitute, hated, maybe persecuted by the government. He's like, oh yeah, you couldn't be happy then. And you spent the whole book arguing that happiness had nothing to do with those things, and then you kind of like, well, yeah, well, of course you have to have some money. So I think that's maybe a failure of imagination there, right? Like, what about, I don't know, Mother Teresa? Like, what about Jesus? What about some of these, St. Francis of Assisi, you know, what about some of these poor, destitute, sort of no worldly goods? Is that kind of what you're thinking about? Yeah. Sometimes people just say joy is like true happiness, you know?
Right.
And I mean, that's what he's talking about. The true one, the permanent one, the one that once you have it, it's very, very hard to lose it. Okay, so check out this argument. He says, we assume the gods to be above all other beings, blessed and happy. But what sort of actions must be assigned to them? What are the gods doing all day? Are they doing acts of justice? No, that would be absurd, because what are they doing? Making contracts and returning deposits and so on? The gods aren't busy with justice. They don't have anything to be just about. Are they doing acts of a brave man, confronting dangers and running risks because it is noble to do so? That doesn't seem right. Are they doing liberal acts, that is to say, generous acts? To whom are they supposed to give? He's imagining the gods being sort of up in Olympus, you know, communing with themselves, not necessarily concerned with human affairs. It would be strange if they're to really have money or anything of the kind. And what would their temperate acts be? Is not such praise tasteless? We got to do the handout for the rest of it here. Since they have no bad appetites, how is the God having self-control, right? Like, I really want to hook up with that mortal woman, but I shouldn't. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's how Homer talks, but Aristotle's like, no. The gods are virtuous. So, what are they doing? All those things would seem to be trivial and unworthy of the gods. So what are they doing? He says, it also seems wrong to say that they're not active. If they're just up in heaven sitting there, that would be weird. We can't expose them to sleep like Endymion, who was a Titan, ? Do you know Endymion, Dr. H? I have not looked him up in a long, long time.
Shelley wrote a poem about Endymion. Yeah, he was one of the Titan type early major gods that famously fell asleep for a very long time. That's all I'm dredging up from my memory banks right now.
So he's using that sort of it's like Hesiod, like pre-Homeric mythology to be like, there are sleeping gods, but that's ridiculous, right? That's just mythology. Now, if you take away from a living being action and still more production, so they're not making anything, what is left but contemplation? They're thinking. The gods are contemplating truth. Therefore, the activity of the god, which surpasses all others in blessedness, must be contemplative. And of human activities, therefore, that which is most akin to this must be most of the nature of happiness. So the gods are thinking about truth, and he even says in a different book, they're thinking about the highest truth, and God is the highest truth, and so God is thinking about himself, but not like in a self-centered way. Right? And that's, I've heard Christians say that. He glorifies himself because he deserves glory. He's the most glorious thing. So it's not self-centered. It's self-centered for me to glorify myself because I'm not God, right? But it's fine for him. So he's saying the most active thing that God does is know truth. He also happens to be true, and therefore he thinks about himself. And so for a human being to be happy, we have to know truth. And so here's my last quote here. But such a life, that is contemplation, as much moral virtue as you need to be able to contemplate well, and as much contemplation as you can handle. Hours a day, probably. Interrupted only by sleep, and maybe by meals, unless you're able to keep up the conversation over a meal, like we're planning to do tonight. But such a life would seem to be too high for man. For it is not insofar as he is man that he will live so, but insofar as something divine, maybe the Logos, is present in him. And by so much as this is superior to our composite nature, our feelings and desires, its activity is superior to that which is the exercise of the other kind of virtue. So the Logos is superior to your body and soul, and so intellectual virtue is more important than moral virtue. But if reason is divine, then in comparison with this typo there, with man, the life according to it, to reason or Logos, is divine, a divine life in comparison with human life. But we must not follow those who advise us, being men, to think of human things. You're just a human being. Keep your mind on things of this earth. Even Aristotle is saying, no. And being mortal, to think of mortal things, but must, so far as we can, make ourselves immortal and strain every nerve to live in accordance with the best thing in us. For even if it is small in bulk, much more does it exceed in power and worth everything else. Right? So, what is he saying? He's saying, you want to be happy. If you could have happiness, you would give up anything else that you think you want right now. If you could be happy being single, you'd be single. You'd give up all those thoughts about love and marriage. If you could be happy being married, you'd give up all those hopes and dreams of singleness. If you could be happy in a ditching career, back that up, a ditch digging career. If you could be happy digging ditches for a living, you would give up your career goals. I don't actually want to do the thing. I want to be happy, and it turns out this is where it is. So you want happiness. So how do you get there? You have to have all the virtues, but especially wisdom. And what do you do when you're wise? You do what God does, and you think about truth as much as possible. As much as you can physically, humanly, animally contemplate truth. And then you will be blessed by the gods, hopefully in favor with men, but you'll have fulfillment and you'll be a true human being. All this without the Bible or the Holy Spirit. What do you think?
Sounds like John Piper. Then he was influenced by Augustine, and Augustine was influenced by Plato and Cicero.
And Aristotle, yeah. I think Augustine read his Aristotle. He only had a few books of Plato available, but he had a lot of Aristotle. So I think he would have, he was very much of a Platonist, but I'm saying he would have probably read his Aristotle the way you and I read whatever, biology, like it's just a given subject. So it sounds like Piper. Jonah says, yeah.
If he's missing the fact though that we're all
It's weird.
like sinners and can't attain virtue on our own, if he's missing that, then he doesn't need to have a savior to help us get there, right? So if you just take that whole thing out, then he's using the same format, just when you can do it on your own, you don't need someone.
Yeah,
You know, that's a pretty big piece.
it's a big piece. It's a big piece, yeah. Agree? Disagree?
What did you say?
I don't know, I just woke up. Right? Like, this is like the ideal life, right?
Okay, yeah.
But we can't do this without Christ because we know we're broken.
What didn't you say earlier that he also affirms that this isn't easy either?
Yeah,
But there's a difference between not easy and not possible.
right.
Right? I would argue that you can't really have virtue without Christ.
The closest thing that I could find in this particular book to a kind of why are most people not virtuous then, Aristotle, if it's just this like process of getting all the stars to align and just growing up, you know?
Someone eventually should have gotten it right.
That's right. And a lot of, most people, maybe not most acorns become trees, but like all the acorns in a particular forest, like they landed and he says the mass of mankind are evidently quite slavish in their tastes, slave-like, short-term thinking, not really rational, preferring a life suitable to beasts, that is, going from meal to meal, right? This is the Norm Macdonald joke where he's like, I was going to write my biography, but I realized I just wake up in the morning and eat some Count Chocula, cereal, and then I kind of rummage around the house for a little bit and have some more food, and then I go outside and I eat some more, and I realized my biography would be terrible, so I made it up. Made up this whole life story. But like most of us, we just go from meal to meal, right? It's like time to sleep, time to eat. Oh my gosh, I gotta eat again. And it's sleep time again. And if all you're thinking about is getting a good meal and getting some good sleep, how are you different from a cow? Not speaking to weight. I'm just saying, like, he says it's the bovine life. What does a cow do? It wakes up and starts chewing on the grass. Chewing. Look up. Chewing. So that's like a kind of maybe allusion to like, hey, look, why are people so sinful? This seems to be afflicting the mass of mankind. But at the same time, you're right. He does say it's possible. It requires exertion and does not consist in amusement. But he just thinks that he's done it. And I would say he's a virtuous person, not to say he's not a sinner, but he has virtue. And some pagans are more virtuous than others. Like Chesterton said, would you rather live in Rome, where they worship the god of justice, and they have courts, or Carthage, where they worship the god Moloch, who eats babies? They're both pagans, but there's pagans and there's pagans. So virtuous pagans, if I had the choice. But still, like, how does this work with fallenness? That's where... But isn't it amazing that even given fallenness, like, was he getting like secret help from God? So you don't have to acknowledge, I mean, he kind of does acknowledge God.
Or the
Or the God, yeah.
I feel like he acknowledges that like everything has a purpose, which is great. It's like some people are like, there's no purpose, we're all in that. But like as a Christian, our purpose in the Bible is completely different than just being intellectual and getting wisdom. Obviously,
What is
value
it?
in that.
What would you say it is? The biblical purpose or flourishing, fulfillment, happiness, joy?
To be faithful to the Lord and
To
go
glorify
and make
God.
glorify God, but to go and make disciples of every nation, baptizing them and teaching them.
But like man was created to glorify God.
Yeah.
Ooh, okay. How? Glorify God how? Like say,
Well,
I
that part
glorify
with
you.
Well, there was like you're familiar with him, I assume, but like
Yeah.
his phrasing with Christian hedonism is essentially, God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in Him.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when it comes to like that, it's like
Satisfaction? Yeah. Because even making disciples isn't our purpose as human beings. That's the purpose of the disciples post-redemption to redeem the rest of the world, to get us back on the track of living our best
And
life.
when they were in the garden, they were supposed to enjoy God and enjoy.
Sorry.
I was like, Joel.
Yeah. Adam's purpose wasn't to evangelize, to multiply.
enjoy God, to live life with God.
That's
Yeah.
right.
All that He's created.
In Socratic pedagogy, did massive job we talking about good life, the Christian life, and what the goals of a Christian good life, like the good life is, and it's I think we all agree, it's to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever.
So, but yeah, it's weird that he can kind of affirm like, okay, like this, the end goal, because even though like intellectual virtue, it's a vessel to get happy, or like all these things, right? Wisdom and etc. It's nearly a vessel to get happy, and so that happiness is the end goal. That's basically our end goal as well. Though again, how we attain it is different. But those are still means that, or things that need to be addressed in that process as well.
Yeah, so tell me more about the differences. Do we need to maybe wrap up to go to the cafe?
Yeah, maybe in 10 minutes.
dinner?
Yeah.
So, here's a Bible verse I never underlined. Okay? A Bible
Say a Bible verse you never underlined.
that I never underlined. Yes, it's like one of those Bible verses that's there. It's in the Bible, it's just not in my mind. Like in Matthew 25 or something, where it's like, what?
The Olivet Discourse.
Just after it's the resurrection. Maybe it's 27. It's like, and then the sky went dark, and then some dead people came out of their graves and talked to everybody, and then anyhow back to the crucifixion. You're like, what? So here's a verse that, as I read it, says, "We've been given all things that pertain to life and godliness." So there's nothing that can be. Is that too small?
The whole Bible on the screen there.
Like I'm so intent on this word. Okay, so assume that you've been given. This is not an earning your salvation type of thing. It's all things that pertain to life and godliness have been given to us by His divine power through the knowledge of Him who called us to His own glory and excellence, by which He granted us His precious and very great promise. Granted, past tense, so that through them you may become partakers of the divine nature, having escaped from the corruption of the world, past tense, because of sinful desire. For this very reason, what? Make every effort to supplement your faith with virtue. And that's when I see virtue, I go, oh yeah, Aristotle could say that. And what else? Supplement your virtue with knowledge. So he's not saying work, you need virtue to be saved. He's saying, given that you have been given the great promises, strive for virtue. And all these, of course, he goes on to brotherly affection, love. But those first two, that's the part my mind just skipped over. Peter is telling me, I have to, as a Christian, pursue virtue, not optional. Right? So what's the difference? You said it's a different path to get to the glorifying God what if I just said the way that I glorify God? If I am an imago Dei thing, that's what I are. That's what I is, sorry. Grammatical here. That's what I is, yes. That's what we is. Then the thing that I do is I glorify God. And when I glorify God well, I do it by virtuing and maybe contemplating. Now, substitute out contemplation with like prayer. Just beholding God, right? Have you ever done contemplative prayer practice where you don't say anything, you don't read anything, you don't ask anything, you simply behold God? That's very powerful, right? It's like, I can talk to a stranger, I can maybe stand in silence next to a good friend, right, if we're like driving, but like, I can't sit in silence eye to eye with very many people. That's very close, that's very intense, right? Just beholding somebody is very intimate. So what if you could just behold God? Would that be an intellectual activity? Not like to say schoolwork.
Wouldn't it fall under the category of enjoying him? Wouldn't that be moral?
Enjoying him, yeah. Emotionally enjoying him,
Well, it's like dwelling.
desiring him.
It's like dwelling on the truth.
There might be a problem there, yeah, with there's not enough oomph towards the truth. Like, you know, I was reading a book of monastic spirituality today, and they're talking a lot about desiring God, right? That's a Piper thing. I think he wrote a book to that effect. Back in my mind somewhere. Desiring God or something. Yearning for God, I forget. But, you know, so there's like an oomph. There's like a yearning, a longing for God. And maybe Aristotle's too clinical. Like, we must know the truth and examine it with our minds at all times, and then we be godlike and blessed.
Sounds like Jedi speak.
So I guess, so the difference that lies between him and us would be, I guess, I know this isn't a word, disjointedness of like all of those things versus with us it's more cohesive where, I mean, he relates it where you can't have one without the other two and so on, but I guess the practical aspect of that doesn't look like that for him, and for us it does.
Yes. And you can't imagine, kind of this is where I think you were going. You can't imagine like a slave who's not intellectual being happy. He's just like, oh gosh, no. They have to be formed, they have to be virtuous, first of all, formed in a certain way, and intellectual.
Question for him, do you get happier the more wisdom or intellectual virtue you behold?
Yeah.
Okay, because I mean for us, like, our peak, not in a, obviously in a bad sense or with a derogatory connotation, but like once we know who God is and we know scripture and we can contemplate that, like you don't have to be a genius to know that, and you can be joyful in that. So like with that slave that's not quote unquote intellectual, but they know that we believe or we affirm that you can be happy and joyous in that, you know. So with him, like,
Faith like a child, right?
yeah.
The disciples are, well, not the smartest bunch, but they're smart, and then they're like, how do we be greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And he like grabs a child. Yeah, it is. So that seems, yeah.
So for Aristotle, is it more like quantitative then? Like the higher you go is based upon how much, you know, how much you can wrestle with or grapple your feelings, desires, and truth, and then you reach higher levels of happiness.
Yeah, that seems right. Quantitative as opposed to like, no, this simple, faithful.
Like you just have it, and versus it's ever growing, or like you can potentially have ever growing amounts.
And like Anthony the Great, Anthony the Desert, one of these early Christian monks, you know, he was illiterate. Like he wasn't even non-intellectual. He just could read, and he was visited by some philosophers, and they said, "How can you live out here without books?" And he opens up his cell and he says, "Look, the trees and the stars, and these are my books. I read them, right? I learn about the glory of God just from the created things." So it's not necessarily, book learning. Although Aristotle might be forgiven for mistaking him for saying that. Like, he's kind of saying that, like, you have to be smart and intellectual in a certain way to be happy. And like slaves and like non-Greeks and probably women aren't going to be really like, yeah, probably not gonna, yeah. Not in this. Oh yeah.
Women can't be happy.
It's only half.
That's
It's
what
all right.
You can be like defectively happy, He doesn't say
I have felony.
anything disparaging about women in this book, but it does occur elsewhere where it's just like, yeah. Other thoughts from those who haven't shared?
But the question,
Yeah.
and obviously I don't believe this, but like when we talk about truth,